What's up, everyone? Welcome to Weekends with Anna and Michael. Joining you is Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. Michael, how are you doing?
I'm doing as well as can be expected, Anna. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. Got to be honest with the audience at all times. Certainly burnt out with the news cycle. Woke up feeling uninspired. It's just, I feel like the same nonsense gets recycled in the news every single day. The same, honestly, unimportant controversies, the same talking heads in the media making the stories about them. I can't stand it. It's just the most frustrating time in America for a number of different reasons. But, the way that this crisis has been handled, both by the government and the way it's been covered by so-called journalists in, U.S. media has been devastating. And it just kind of shows you all of the different ways in which society is broken and isn't working for the average American.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about that. I was reading about the CDC report that the Trump administration suppressed. We've got this rush to reopen, which is going to jeopardize, obviously, a lot of people's lives. And it's also not going to work economically because it's not factoring in people's behavioral changes. People are not sitting at home unbelievably excited to go to a restaurant where they could contract this thing. And then, of course, on the other hand, you have Andrew Cuomo basically using this as basically a lab, New York, for his own version of a kind of authoritarian neoliberalism and outsourcing schools even more so to technology and everything. So, yeah, it's really disheartening and it's really it's depressing. And I don't think social media helps. Although I had something that happened to me this week that far outweighs any of that. It's way more upsetting. Do you want to hear it?
Yeah. What happened?
Some guy, I was on Blogging Heads with Robert Wright. Robert Wright's a very good dude. Talking about my new book, Against the Web, Cosmopolitan Answer to the New Right. Order it today at Red Emma's. It's a very good book, and many, many, many people are saying so. This guy writes that I have the same IQ level as Dave Rubin. And I got to say, even though I'm not I have criticisms of IQ as a test. I'm certainly not one of these IQ twerps running around. That stung me. That was a lot.
Yeah, you were compared to maybe the dumbest person in media in the country. Like, I mean, that insult
that was a lot.
Deep. No, that's a lot. I mean, obviously he's wrong. I mean, how could anyone look, Michael, sometimes I listen to your show, like TMBS. I love TMBS. I'm obsessed with it. Sometimes you get into these lengthy, I guess, monologues, whatever you want to call it, when you're interviewing someone and you start getting into probably monologue. Yeah, you do that a lot, which yeah. I actually like. I think it adds a lot to the conversation because it's more of a conversation, not you just throwing questions at someone and then not really engaging. But anyway, you get into all this philosophical theory and the dialectic, and I'm like, what the fuck is he talking about, right? And the fact that anyone would think that you have the same IQ as Dave Rubin, who doesn't seem to know how the post office works, blows my mind. That person has the same IQ as Dave Rubin.
I thought it was actually genuinely pretty funny. Especially because I think it was very earnestly written. I don't think it was you're a fucking idiot. I think it was just the funny thing is that he and Dave probably score similarly on standardized tests. But who knows? I mean, I don't know. I was never a great, I probably wouldn't be a great test taker, hence my skepticism of tests. But yeah.
I was a terrible test taker. You know why standardized tests are trash? Because it's just a way of seeing how well you can take a test. The SAT, for instance, is specifically crafted in a way to ask trick questions and see if you know the way the test writers have phrased certain things in a certain way to direct you toward the right answer. If you are a child coming from an immigrant family or a working class family, and you don't have the means to buy these insanely expensive test prep classes, then you're screwed. I've totally felt that when I was in high school. Like prepping for the SAT was madness because, you know, you have the well-to-do students who can like totally pay for those expensive classes. And it wasn't about seeing how much you know. It was more about, hey, is this person savvy enough to know how to take this very specific test? Right. That has trick questions in it. It's just so stupid.
Totally. And it also, right. And then like what your attitude was about college was also like, it took me, I understood that it was advantageous because even though I didn't come from a background of private colleges or anything like that at all, and I definitely didn't have any money, I grew up in Massachusetts, and everybody there is a culture in parts of Massachusetts that are definitely obsessed with Ivy League colleges and private liberal arts college. Like that is a real touchstone for a lot of people. And so I sort of made it my business to figure out how to, you know, get into what I thought was a decent school. And what you realize though when you get there is like if you know, and there's obviously so many extreme differences around this, but like people who got there from like working class backgrounds or people of color who had a working class background or basically like if you didn't come from like a prep school, there was this like very earnest like, oh shit, I gotta like figure out grades, I gotta do all this. And then you really realize that if you're actually at these places to like advance your career, this is just purely the social networking opportunity and the brand. And of course you shouldn't like screw up your grades. And of course you should cultivate relationships with professors, but like, this isn't, you know, your path to Wall Street or whatever else is not paved necessarily unless you have some kind of truly exceptional quant ability by like hitting the books. You've got to like hit the social circuit. And that's another thing that people who, you know, they either don't have the money or like the social training to understand how this stuff works. So yeah,
totally,
yeah. So the point is, I am smarter than Dave Rubin, and fuck you.
100%.
How dare you?
I'll sign on to that.
That's like, how low is the bar in quarantine? I'm just playing. I thought that was really funny. I legit.
It is really funny.
I've laughed at something like that in a while. So thank you.
Yeah. And it's especially funny when like you have one person, Dave Rubin, like running away from any type of substantive debate on any substantive issue. Right. I feel like you'd be comfortable debating anyone about any issue. So anyway, why don't we talk about the show a little bit, what the audience can look forward to. Later in the program, we're going to interview Glenn Greenwald on maintaining civil liberties in the age of Corona. We've seen some of those civil liberties certainly rolled back in various countries. It's been pretty devastating in Kenya, for instance. And the same could happen to us if we're not cognizant of how crises and tragedies in this country have been used by bad actors in order to roll back our rights. So we'll talk to Glenn Greenwald about striking the right balance, because it is important to make sure that we protect people while this pandemic continues. And later in the show, we will talk about Donald Trump's relentless cuckathon, which is basically targeting Republican politicians who refuse to be loyal to him. It's incredible to watch.
It's the only thing he's good at.
Right. It's true. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and start with my commentary today. And it's something that I'm thinking about more and more as we see the change in the Democratic Party post-Trump. So I've come to realize that no amount of electoral maneuvering is going to create a Democratic Party that's really going to carry out the best interests of workers in this country. And nothing made that more abundantly clear for me than what happened to the party post 2016. When Trump got elected, conventional wisdom among some Democratic voters was that the Democratic Party would learn some incredibly important lessons, that maybe they would consider the fact that Donald Trump paraded around as someone who's going to look out for the best interests of blue collar workers. Now, of course, he was disingenuous. He doesn't really care about creating a more equitable system for Americans. All he thinks about is really using the office of the presidency to enrich himself and his friends. But do Democrats understand how appealing that message is, the message that he pretended to have, which is to look out for workers, to create an equitable system? And the truth is they didn't learn a lesson because they made a very specific political calculation post-Trump. The Democratic leadership has calculated that it makes more sense to side with a small sliver of the Republican Party that finds Donald Trump gross, that finds Donald Trump a threat to our democratic process. These are people like David Frum, Bill Kristol, Meghan McCain. These are people who do not have our best interests in mind, do not care about incredibly important issues like income inequality, or maybe a better approach when it comes to foreign policy. These are just people who don't like Trump. And so they made an appeal to Democratic leadership. And unfortunately, their influence during the primaries is obvious, it's evident. And it was also highlighted in, I can't believe I'm about to say this, a pretty good piece in 538. So I'm going to give you a few excerpts from that piece, and then I'm going to tell you guys what I think probably makes the most sense in this new era of a Democratic Party that has somehow moved even further to the right. So Perry Bacon Jr. at 538 writes, "Never Trumpers are increasingly involved in the Democratic Party and have gradually shifted their tactics in that direction, effectively becoming a never Trump and never Bernie Sanders coalition. And they appear to be having more success shaping their new party than the one that many of them had been associated with for much of their lives." So keep in mind that this is actually a pretty small group of people, especially when you compare the percentage of these never Trump Republicans to a much larger group of progressive Democrats who want progressive policy proposals. So for instance, conservatives who really hate Trump probably no longer identify as Republicans. And that's about 11% of Republicans who switched their party affiliation between December of 2015 and March of 2017, according to Pew. Data suggests at most 10% of American voters overall are anti-Trump, but generally lean Republican. But these people, as we noticed during the Democratic primary, have an outsized influence over our discourse, okay? And certainly in the media. They are overrepresented in the media. All of a sudden, we're getting like strategic advice from the Bill Kristols and David Frums of the world. What? Right? So you see them all over MSNBC, you see them all over, various cable news channels. MSNBC, for instance, has programs fronted by two anti-Trump hosts who closely aligned with the GOP establishment. So that's ex-Representative Joe Scarborough and Nicole Wallace, who was a former communications director for President George W. Bush. And then also among the 53 Washington Post opinion writers highlighted on their paper's website, 7 are people who identified as conservatives and or Republican Party in the past, but regularly attack Trump. So like those people are overrepresented. Obviously, it's incredibly rare to see pro-Bernie commentary or columns in some of these like legacy outlets. I'm always fascinated by the way, the establishment has responded to someone like Liz Bruenig, for instance, who certainly does identify as a supporter of Bernie Sanders. She happens to be a columnist at the New York Times. And I remember when she announced that, I thought to myself, how the hell did this happen? Because people like her are not welcomed in some of these legacy outlets. And they've been pretty vicious toward her. I mean, look at the commentary and the reaction to her on Twitter, for instance. But there's no problem inviting people who have made insanely poor decisions previously, people like David Frum and Bill Kristol, who dragged us into a war with Iraq. For some reason, their opinion is more valued in legacy media and also among Democratic leadership than the opinion of progressive Democrats. And so it's not wrong to be disillusioned by electoral politics. I think it is wrong to think that maybe moving toward a third party would work. I don't think that that's strategically viable, honestly, if we want to accomplish progressive proposals. But I just want to give you guys just a little taste of the kind of commentary we heard from these Never Trumpers during the primary. Take a look.
This is a moment of tremendous danger, and it calls on all of us to make sacrifices of some of our preferences. It wasn't easy for me to vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016 for the common good. I think one of the places I start when thinking about this is to remember, if you ask Americans the question, how are you feeling about your finances? How are you feeling about your health care? You get in 2020 the most positive responses of any year since 1998. While Bernie Sanders speaks to the disaffected, the people who are content with the status quo are stronger than they have been at any time since the late 1990s. Donald Trump will be a tough president to beat. And flipping the Senate and imposing some costs on the Republicans there for protecting Donald Trump, that's going to be even more difficult. If almost anybody else were the incumbent president of the United States right now, Scott Walker, Jeb Bush, Hillary Clinton, that person would be cruising to an easy re-election. So in the face of the extraordinary difficulty of defeating a dangerous president at a time of prosperity, you have to choose very wisely. And Bernie Sanders, appealing as he is to people who listen to this program, for example, has never fought a hard race.
Okay, so I show you that clip. And to be fair to Democracy Now!, they had Bhaskar on there as well to debate David Frum, which is important to do. But at the same time, like, that was the message that we heard over and over again in the media in regard to Bernie Sanders. He's not electable. We know that you like his policy proposals. We know that it polls really well. We know that single payer polls really well. We know that, a more equitable system polls really well. But no, he's not electable. He's not electable. You should be afraid of Trump. He's not electable. And they propped up Joe Biden, who I would argue is much less electable, especially now with the Tara Reade allegations against him. But nonetheless, again, the Democratic Party made their calculation. They aligned themselves with Republicans in order to beat Donald Trump, in their mind, beat Donald Trump. And so they have this candidate now, Joe Biden, who is not only where he is today because of this unlikely coalition working together, like this unlikely coalition forming and propping him up. This is also going to lead to a candidate who, A, was already pretty conservative, but B, is going to be influenced by the very people who helped him get the nomination. So, for instance, recently, Joe Biden was talking about how he's thinking about naming Republicans in his campaign, or I should say cabinet. So he's okay with Republicans in his cabinet. That should blow everyone's mind, except when you really look at it, no, it shouldn't, because some Republicans, the Never Trumpers, helped him get to where he is today. This is a long way of saying that the electoral politics has a lot of people feeling down and disillusioned, but this is also a learning experience. It's a teachable moment to really focus on where we do have the power. And it's something that you talk about a lot, Michael. You talk about how really the power is with labor. And if we want to get things accomplished, the way we do it isn't by hoping that we can somehow elect the right people to help us out. Because even if we do elect the right people, there are still structural issues in our system of government that hold them back from accomplishing the progressive policy proposals that we need. There's still a great deal of corruption in our politics. And that money that politicians need in order to run their elections, it's incredibly influential and goes against what we need policy-wise. So I'm looking at some of the strikes that have taken place in this country, historically, and how those worker-led strikes have actually accomplished the things that workers desperately need. I want to give you just a few examples. For instance, there was the Wheeling-Pittsburgh Steel Corporation strike. That was a 10-month strike involving steel workers at 8 plants in 3 states. It ended in August of 1997. The union said that through that strike, they were able to secure boosted pension benefits for the company's steel workers and provided for their retirements, obviously. It also allowed the Wheeling company to reduce the workforce by 20%. So unfortunately, there were some concessions that the workers had to make, but what they wanted was to protect their pension. They wanted to be able to retire early. And through their strike, they were able to accomplish that. There's the U.S. Postal Strike of 1970. At that point, you had more than 200,000 employees in 30 cities participating in this U.S. Postal Strike. And activists halted mail service in major parts of the country, including New York, Detroit, Philadelphia. At that point, President Richard Nixon declared a state of emergency. And despite the military's efforts to quell the strikes, a deal was eventually struck, resulting in higher pay and better labor conditions under the Postal Recognition Act of 1970. Now, this is not to say that all strikes work. As we've seen with the GM workers striking, it's a risky thing to do, and it's likely that they'll lose incredibly important protections or things like their health care, right? But maybe rather than focusing on funding politicians or donating to politicians, and we saw how much money someone like Bernie Sanders was able to raise through small dollar donors, maybe we create some sort of worker solidarity fund that helps workers pay their bills and support themselves if they choose to organize, mobilize, and strike. That way, there's some sort of social safety net that progressives create in order to help workers out if they choose to stand up to their employers and fight for something better. That's just a suggestion, but I'm curious to hear what you think, Mike.
No, I think that that's awesome. I think that that is so on point. And actually looking at how we can concretely help like the Amazon strikes that were going on in terms of, helping people pay their bills while they do that, or the Teamsters local in Philadelphia that I've talked about. I think that's really important, and I think that that is going to be one of the ways that the rubber meets the road in terms of these things. I also think it's 100% right that basically the both parties do want to represent different facets of basically, on one hand, the oligarchy, let's just say it, like the base of the Republican Party is still a handful of billionaires and ultra rich people. The Democratic Party has its ultra wealthy donors, and they might have some differing attitudes, which are relevant. It's relevant, obviously, as we've said a million times, whether or not you want to protect people, DACA recipients, or you have some basic commitment to civil equities in terms of not against housing discrimination or for voting rights or things like that. Now, Democrats and their donors don't often do a great job on these things, and there's a reason why these things have been sort of put under such enormous pressure, both because of the stacking of the judiciary by the Republicans and, the Republicans winning political fights, even as they're actually on those issues, they are demographically in retreat. They shouldn't be sort of gaining new grounds, but they have been, and I think there's a variety of reasons for that. But again, with the same core donor base and class interests, there's going to be alignment around concentration of wealth, around corporate power, around the capital advantage over labor. And one of the really disturbing ways that this manifests too, and I think you see this definitely also in Europe, is that the center has a twofold game where it basically says, we can understand and we can hear some of the economic problems that people like Bernie Sanders talk about, but fundamentally we can't really do anything, right? Maybe we can, maybe, and probably not, certainly in the United States, do some kind of small moves to ameliorate those trends in terms of inequality and lower living standards. And then they play a double game with the populist right, where they'll say, oh my God, these people are horrible, they're racist, they're xenophobes, they aren't socially progressive. And then on the back end, they'll actually say, okay, and particularly you see this in Europe. I think it's a little bit more complicated in the United States, though we see a fair amount of this in the United States too. Where can we meet you 70% of the way on what your actual migration agenda is, as an example? And so you have this incredible move where they're demonizing working class people and suggesting that they're the cause of xenophobia, which they are not, discounting all of their economic concerns across the board. And then on one hand, kind of, hysterically moralizing and correctly calling out the bigotry of the populist right, while actually acquiescing to a fair amount of that agenda. And, that's why at the end of the day, at Davos, Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro and Modi and all these other characters, there's money to be made. There's deals to be struck. They're going to get a nice reception. Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn never would be.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. And this is not to say that we should completely resign from any type of strategy or strategical thinking when it comes to electoral politics. My argument is we need to think about short-term gains, but also the long-term game of doing what we can to protect the material interests of working people, but also thinking about what we can do to change the structure and the system under which our electoral politics works, right? So I think that the number one issue is that we do have two different parties that are controlled by people who only have their financial interests in mind. And so you're right in that there are some differences between the two parties. But when it comes to economic policy that has a huge impact on our day-to-day lives, they're very much in agreement with one another, which is why the Democratic establishment will welcome the never-Trumper Republicans with welcome arms while flipping off people who have voted as Democrats but identify more left, people who identify as progressives. Implementing those policy proposals that progressives are demanding challenges the power that Democratic lawmakers have, and they don't like it. And so, yeah, they've made this calculation, and it certainly worked out for them during the Democratic primary this time around. But remember, these never-Trump Republicans did all sorts of maneuvering during the Republican primary back in 2016, and they failed miserably. And so it's hilarious to me that the Democratic Party thinks that being in cahoots with them now and working with them now will somehow help the Democratic Party beat Donald Trump. I think that that's a flaw in their logic, but I guess that remains to be seen.
It remains to be seen, but I totally agree. And actually, my commentary builds or fits really nicely with yours. So let's recognize that right-wing populism is mostly a scam. That even as Donald Trump or Tucker Carlson or Josh Hawley can occasionally and with great effect, and obviously much better than you'll hear from Nancy Pelosi or most MSNBC hosts, critique how capitalism is working. And yes, there are parties in Europe that, because of Europe's political traditions, are more likely to actually support social policies and fit that together with programs of extreme xenophobia, that at the end of the day, the policy trends, and we can see this over several years now, whether we're looking at the United States or Brazil or Hungary or India or Israel, is that these right-wing governments do not have a serious economic strategy. Let's focus on the United States. Look at the bailouts. The bailouts are a massive consolidation of wealth and power for the financial sector. They have almost no labor protections, no systemic relief for working people. This was the bill that was primarily devised by Mitch McConnell, happily signed by Donald Trump, and with a slush fund for the comically corporatist hack who should have been charged by Kamala Harris, Steve Mnuchin, to oversee as Treasury Secretary. The main domestic policy accomplishment of the Trump administration, in addition to tons of executive orders, which have, as we all know, generated an enormous and brutal welfare on migrant and refugee populations, but also just on standard issue Republican stuff, making it easier to pollute, making it easier to hide, getting rid of protection around Foreign Corrupt Practices Acts. all those things through executive orders in the executive branch. The main policy achievement after trying to destroy Obamacare, we all know Obamacare, and they still are trying to destroy Obamacare. And we all know, of course, that Obamacare is nothing like a solution. The only way out of the healthcare crisis and the only humane answer is universal governmental healthcare for everybody in the United States. That being said, the main primary domestic push of Trump when he first got into office was try to get 30 million people, 30 million people off of their health insurance, primarily by canceling Medicaid expansion, which was the most successful part and the most just part of Obamacare. They passed a huge tax cut bill that primarily went to the wealthy, and also have waged a relentless war against people who rely on food stamps. Now, we all know that where they go when they actually sort of diagnose the problems of inequality and the collapse of family structure and things like that is, of course, to nationalism and various rhetoric of blaming immigrants and diversity as a substitute for the problems caused by capitalism. And of course, we morally object to that and fight against that on humanitarian grounds. And this also reveals a total strategic divergence between a left or materialist answer to these problems and the right-wing scam that gets us there. And it also, again, is going to give us important lessons for how to build a left that might actually have some mass appeal and might have some sound strategic thinking. None of these right-wing figures in the United States are pro-labor union in any systemic way. They might occasionally hint at pro-labor policies, although rarely with any substantive follow-through, and certainly not from the Trump administration or most Republicans in Congress. They might occasionally say, yeah, maybe we should think about raising wages if they're in media, as an example. Or if they're Josh Hawley, they might do some very smart repatriation on supply chains, which we should be working on. But of course, you can't separate from their xenophobia and rush to create a dangerous Cold War with China. But when you push them on labor unions, and I'll cite again our friend Dustin Guastella, he says guys like Bannon, who make this big show of being different kinds of Republicans, they sound like country club types. They all of a sudden don't feel so comfortable about backing union policies. You've certainly never seen an actual right-wing populist move would be to say the Democrats have lied about supporting card check. We're going to support it. That might actually be a move of jiu-jitsu, which you're never going to see. And let's actually look. I'm going to quote from a Jacobin piece in 2019 called On Trump's War on Workers. Let me just give you some examples of what Donald Trump's administration actually has done with regards to labor itself. Trump has wasted no time in rolling back many of the rather mild labor regulations that are in place to give workers some level of protection. He supported the repeal of Obama's Fair Play and Safe Workplace executive order that protected workers from wage theft. Before Trump, workers had to earn $23,000 a year before the requirement of overtime pay kicked in. Now that requirement has been moved to $35,000, eliminating the opportunity for growing low-wage workers in the American economy. And for these same low-wage workers, Trump ran on supporting a $10 minimum wage and has not taken any action on it. Of course, Trump has also said at other times that American wages are too high. Yes, he renegotiated NAFTA with some slightly enhanced labor protections, but the overall structure of that trade deal doesn't change anything. And this is a really important point, because a right-wing populist story is always going to need to go to cultural answers for economic and material problems at their roots. Now, to be really clear, and this is where the left can make mistakes, it's not about saying that family life doesn't matter or community life doesn't matter. If those things are constricted in a way that excludes certain families or says that only people from certain backgrounds or certain identities have a right to those things, then of course we fight against them completely. But at the same time, this isn't like this is where rhetoric about abolishing the family or things like that, some of the only places in life where people might potentially feel some refuge in today's world, is totally counterproductive and foolish sort of rhetoric to lead with. We have to say that the breakdown of community life, people not having free time, people not being able to build the lives they want, however they conceive it, is a big problem that we have answers to as well. But we understand that the base of why those problems are developing is because of massive inequality, increased work hours, a freelance economy, and basically capitalism. So, and I hope people can see the distinction I'm making here, because again, the liberal objection to this stuff is to point out the moral depravity of the sexism and the racism and all these other things, which we absolutely condemn and see as well. That's absolutely part of it. But we also have to look dispassionately at the real problems that these people are pointing to, and then say, again, not only are the answers they're providing xenophobic, toxic, and bigoted, they also will fundamentally never work because they don't have an actual strategy to empower the only sustainable source of counterweight to capital, which is labor. And the only way of connecting an emergent left that takes place in a lot of areas like this, people consuming media, people with college backgrounds, and so on, is to build out a left that can sort of run in tandem with a revived labor movement and think strategically in that way. And that means practically thinking about how we can best be of service of people who are going on strike, how we can, not as sort of intervening liberals with good ideas or the right approach, give other people strategy, but actually what the material conditions are demanding from people, the enormous risks and costs of that, and how we can be supportive of that. Now, fortunately, polls are changing. Labor unions, after being sort of under siege for decades, and of course they still are economically under siege, public opinion polls are changing. In 2019, look at this graph here. This is a significant upsurge in people's support of organized labor because they recognize that that's the only ground from which to have protection, and for more bold goals like genuinely democratizing the economy or giving people actual say over their lives and how they live it, we recognize that labor is going to be the base of that. So in a way, we're lucky because this right-wing populism is doomed to fail as a project, but we can only seize on that opportunity if we get real and we get strategic and we leave these people in the dustbin of history where they belong.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And one thing that I would also bring up is the right-wing populism is only perpetuated by the terrible messaging that comes from Democratic leadership. So, the example of Nancy Pelosi in front of her expensive refrigerators, that was very effectively used against the Democratic Party by members of the right. And so they're able to position themselves as individuals who are looking out for the best interests of working Americans, when in reality, behind the scenes, we know what they're capable of and we know what they've done. We know that they had absolutely no interest in creating more jobs or increasing wages by cutting taxes for the top 1%. $2 trillion in tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, and none of that money went toward improving the lives of employees. All it went toward was buying up stocks, right? The corporate stock buybacks. And so we also need to be mindful of the failure of messaging on the Democratic side. But I think that independent media can do a better job in just really highlighting what Tucker Carlson's really doing, right? And it reminds me of the debate I had with Ann Coulter a few years ago. At one point during the debate, she said this. She claimed that she was concerned about immigrants coming into the country because they're going to take fast food jobs away from Black people. So,
sure.
Because Ann Coulter, of all people, is very concerned about Black people. First off, boxing Black Americans into fast food work.
Right.
And saying like, oh, the real enemy here is, the immigrants who are coming in and taking these jobs away from them. No, I would argue that we have an entire economic structure that's the real problem here. And it's not working for anyone except for those at the top.
Absolutely. There's no question about it. And again, as long as we leave those openings for them, we have to be able to answer, not just on grounds we're comfortable with. We have to be able to talk about things like community in the terms that we talk on them, which is inclusive, broad-based, and cosmopolitan, but also, receptive to different people's desires and how they want to live and how they want to do things. And then we also just need to relentlessly say, look, if you're concerned about fast food workers, then why don't you support paying everybody $25 an hour and single payer healthcare? And there really is no way around it. There is no coherent policy way around that. And the only way to ensure those gains, to protect those gains, is labor unions, which is why all the data we have from across the world shows higher labor union concentration and power increases living standards, period. It's undebatable, no matter how much propaganda says otherwise. All right, guys, we are going to take a very brief break, and then we're going to come back with our guest, Glenn Greenwald. If you're watching this, hit the like button. And if you're new to the channel, make sure you hit subscribe and the bell so you get the notifications. This is Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. I'm Michael Brooks. Joining us now is Glenn Greenwald. He's a journalist for the Intercept. He joins us now. Glenn, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a very exciting combination, you two, and I'm glad to see your new show.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Glenn, we wanted to talk to you about the Corona age and civil liberties in general. And we'll just start off what will be a pretty broad-based conversation with some terrifying footage from Singapore of a robotic dog I think the company is Boston Dynamics, basically walking around a park in Singapore with an automated message telling people to keep their social distance. This dog also has monitoring abilities, so it can track sort of like how many people are coming in and out of the park and so on. I mean, what do you think of this, Glenn? Are you excited by this amazing, innovative new technology and looking forward to bringing it to a park near you?
Yeah, I'm really giddy about it. I love this kind of mechanized government surveillance and control, as everybody knows. I think on the one hand, you can look at it in a very clinical and rational way and say, well, look, there's nothing particularly menacing about it. The police themselves are often abusive and inhuman. This is nothing more than the analog of, say, a fighter pilot being replaced by a drone pilot so that there's still a human operating the controls and whatever it does, it's doing solely because there's a human behind it. So what really is the difference between having that there and having a human perform similar functions? But I think the reason that particular video resonated for me and then for so many people, it went really viral almost immediately after I posted it, is because you can see the potential for abuse, just like there is a difference between having a fighter pilot endangering her or his life, flying over a particular territory and dropping a bomb. The danger to that human and the human sense becomes a constraint on the kind of violence that could be imposed. Whereas if it's just like a video game where somebody's in a trailer in Colorado flying a drone, a mechanized drone over Yemen or Afghanistan or Pakistan, it's much easier to just kind of distance yourself psychologically from the humanity involved because you're just seeing it digitally on a screen. I think it's the same here. I mean, obviously, this particular robot is equipped with no weapons, only with cameras and tracking devices. But you can easily imagine it being equipped with weapons, and there are much more formidable ones already kind of off the assembly line that are immune from resistance or guns. So once these kind of things are unleashed, there's no taking them back, and there's no way to fight them any longer. And I think the most dangerous part is the more we mechanize our interactions, the less humanity there is in it, and the more potential there is for abuse.
Yeah, watching that video, what really struck me was how terrified people in that park were as this robot is just, walking around surveilling the scene. And really, it is terrifying because while we certainly do deal with law enforcement that carries out abuses and brutality, there's still a human element to it. So I like that you mentioned that. I mean, when you're dealing with robots, there's absolutely no compassion, empathy, human emotion attached to it. It's literally just a robot that is enforcing something that's been sold to the general public as a policy that's meant to protect us. And we see that over and over again. I mean, we see it in various contexts. We're certainly seeing it today with the coronavirus. And I do really appreciate the nuanced discussion that you had with Edward Snowden on your podcast, System Update, because this is a difficult issue to navigate when you want to balance civil liberties with keeping the general public safe. And so I appreciated that you came at it from, just this perspective of understanding the importance of social distancing during this pandemic, but wanting to do it in a way that doesn't violate or, encroach upon our civil liberties. And so, how do we do that? What do you think the right answer is? I don't like the surveillance state, but how do we persuade people to actually follow through with these guidelines, especially in a country that's incredibly distrustful toward the government?
Yeah, those are really important but difficult questions to answer. And I found myself grappling with them internally. Obviously, my work as a journalist and then before that as a lawyer has been focused primarily on civil liberties, on defending civil liberties, in turn means just kind of developing an almost instinctive opposition to any attempts to increase government authority and control and power in the name of protecting people from a particular fear. In the last 20 years, that debate has taken place in the context of the war on terror, where I do think overwhelmingly the threat that has been presented to justify increased surveillance powers or detention powers without charges or Guantanamo or rendition or torture or all the wars has been radically and wildly overblown, namely the threat that you're going to die in a terrorist attack at the hands of an Islamic radical group, where the threat is actually less than, for example, the threat that tomorrow you're going to slip in the bathtub and hit your head and die in your own bathtub or go to a restaurant in the pre-COVID days and develop an intestinal illness from something that you eat. The threat was really minuscule versus the powers that were being justified in their name. And I found myself at the beginning of this pandemic kind of having thought processes that I never expected to have, kind of bargaining with myself and kind of the discourse about, well, maybe short-term increases in mass surveillance are necessary or justified in order to stave off more long-term brutal repression like we saw in China in the early stages of the pandemic. Because I think that when you have this terrifying new threat, and I do think the threat of this virus is infinitely greater and more concrete and more real than, say, the threat of terrorism from Islamic radical groups, we're psychologically constructed to have as our first order need survival. And so no matter how much of a civil libertarian you are, no matter how kind of rationally and intellectually equipped you are to resist government authoritarianism, instinctively, you want to be protected from this really scary threat. You want your children to be, you want your family members to be, and your friends and your society. And so you do have this kind of fear that overtakes your rational faculties and makes you vulnerable to government claims that they need more power. And I felt that process much more viscerally than I ever did before. And it took me a couple of weeks to kind of think about the fact that the problem is whatever powers we vest in the government now in the name of temporarily increasing their authority so that they can manage this crisis and get past it, it's tempting that sounds tempting, right? Like, hey, here's just some power for you to hold for a few months or a year until there's a vaccine or there's a treatment or until we're past the epidemiological curve that makes it dangerous. But what we learned from the war on terror, it's the same thing they said about things like the Patriot Act and the authorization to use military force in 2001. Hey, don't worry, this is going to be a couple of years until we get control of this new threat. And here we are 20 years later, and nobody thinks about rescinding the Patriot Act or the authorization to use military force. If you have a vote on it in Congress, it passes by a vote of like 92-6 in the Senate, because it's become a part of our political framework. And that's the same for whatever powers we now vest in government. So, I think that we can do a lot to persuade our fellow citizens of the importance of staying at home. I think people are staying at home voluntarily in large numbers, even where it's not mandated. Not everyone is financially able to do that because not all governments, in fact, most governments aren't providing them with the sustenance they need. So they're forced to go outside often against their will. But I think persuasion and education and kind of collective action of that sort is a much better course than just handing over whatever powers governments claim in the name of managing this crisis.
Glenn, I want to follow up on that and take this in a slightly broader direction. I think one of the things, going back to the Snowden revelations that you reported, and I think just in terms of having a framework for understanding how we protect privacy and civil liberties today, and even the cultural spillover effect of people sort of like, you see the cultural consequences of people not taking like privacy generally seriously, and how that impacts people's relationships, how they relate to the world, how they relate to social media platforms. That we can't just look at the threat to civil liberties as coming from government. We have to look at it as sort of like a hybrid threat. Involving the private sector, involving companies, involving the relationship between the, basically like the surveillance state, but all of the companies that provide the infrastructure of the surveillance state in an age of privatization and hyper capitalism. So I'm also wondering, like, as we push back on this and think about it, do we also need to be really clear with the public and even in our own frameworks that it's like it's government's ability to mandate these things, but it's also like another escalation in what Google or Apple can do as private, basically entirely unregulated or greatly unregulated companies can do in terms of tracking your whereabouts, sharing that with law enforcement officials or even private security firms, and the overall kind of encroachment on our lives, not just from government, but from also really the corporate sector as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would make 2 points about that. One is when I talk about the surveillance state, or even the military industrial complex or the deep state or whatever you want to call, whatever your favorite term is for this kind of permanent power faction that resides in Washington and exerts power regardless of the outcome of elections in fairly similar and constant ways, both in the military/intelligence realm as well as in the financial realm. I don't mean just the government in terms of public entities, because to me, there really is no genuine effective division between government on the one hand and powerful corporations on the other. I see them as far more merged than I do as separate entities. So for me, the surveillance state isn't just the NSA and the FBI and the CIA. It is also Google and Facebook and all those corporations that work in conjunction with those agencies. A big part of the Snowden reporting was how closely intertwined they've become. And the reason for that is that the way our politics in the U.S. is now structured is that both political parties are funded by those corporations and the legislative process is controlled by them. So if you were to have what a healthy republic or democracy would look like, which is government over here and corporations over here, you would have government as supreme in terms of its power, because that would be the power of the people exerting control over corporations, regulating them, placing limits on what they can do, on how much money they can make, on what kind of taxes they have to pay. That exists in theory in the United States, but the reality is way different. I mean, Google and Amazon and these companies are way more powerful than essentially every government. Both political parties are beholden to them. No one really can control them. And they work hand in hand all the time. I see the government more as an arm of corporate power than I see corporations as some separate entity from the state that is subject to its superior authority. So I agree completely. When I talk about privacy, when I talk about the surveillance state, I'm absolutely talking about not just what the NSA and the CIA are doing, but what their partners in Silicon Valley are doing as well. And there's no way to restore or to protect civil liberties by only focusing on public actors and ignoring private actors, because private actors I see are the more powerful entity. Then a related point to that I think is incredibly important to think about is with this quarantine, which I'm in favor of and I believe is necessary and rational, and I'm doing myself. I'm not out there agitating for an end to lockdowns. I do think there have been some excessive use of police power in ways that seem kind of thuggish to me. But by and large, I'm in favor of, I believe in the science and the consensus that this lockdown is necessary. I'm at home, and so I'd be a hypocrite if I thought otherwise. But one of the effects of it is that we're now living our lives more digitally than ever before. We were already living our lives incredibly digitally prior to this pandemic, working online, communicating online, living the major part of our lives, even like intimate, private parts of our lives online that have affected us psychologically. And as a result, depression has been increasing, anxiety disorders, addiction, suicide. There's been lots of research about the effect of the internet and its pervasive effect in our lives on that. But now we're doing that more than ever. So other than the people with whom we're sheltering in place, essentially all our actions are now digital. All our interactions with other people are now digital, which means everything we do in the day goes through Skype that we're using now, or Zoom, or Facebook, or Instagram, or Twitter, which means that we've placed more of our lives than ever before in the hands of these corporations. And as somebody who has done a lot of work over the years on trying to create space for digital privacy, individual privacy in the digital age, it's very alarming to me, because I do think this kind of training that we're getting is going to endure past this pandemic. We're hearing these like proclamations and positive tones about, hey, look, we're learning that we can all work remotely. We don't really need to go into work anymore. Great. So we're all going to just stay at home now, never go out, never looking in each other's eyes, never interact interpersonally, and we're just going to sit in front of our computer screens and live our lives in this kind of virtual reality. It's certainly the case that we're doing that now, and it's making individual privacy extremely elusive.
Yeah, it's so important to touch on that, because it's a great way to divide people and prevent them from engaging with one another, organizing with one another, and creating groups that fight for things that we need together. But what I want to just quickly go back to what you said about this marriage or collaboration between the government and these massive tech companies, because I see that marriage as part of the problem when it comes to encouraging people to stay home. So you alluded to this a little bit, but I want to kind of like suss it out a little more. So one of the best ways, I would argue, to persuade Americans to stay home and not go out is to take care of them and their fundamental needs while they're isolated, self-quarantining, doing what they're supposed to do, following the guidelines. But I mean, even now in this moment of crisis where tens of millions of people are filing for unemployment, which means that many of them have lost their employer provided health insurance, you have a Democratic Party that's unwilling to fight for what people need in order to stay home. Do you think that their relationship with these tech companies plays a role in that? Because these tech companies love tax cuts. These tech companies certainly don't really see a problem with the way they treat some of their workers, right? So is it the tech companies that are persuading Democrats to kind of shy away from passing actual stimulus that would benefit the average American as opposed to these massive multinational corporations? Because I don't think that all the people who are out there protesting are necessarily bad people. I think the media likes to really hone in and focus on some of the more outrageous people who are out there, you know, the people who unfortunately like to carry the swastika signs and everything like that. But I don't think that they're representative of all the people out there protesting these stay-at-home orders. I think that there are Americans who are devastated right now financially because they're forced to stay home. And at the same time, the government hasn't really provided a substantive relief bill that can take care of them while they're at home.
I couldn't agree more. I'll just use Brazil as an example where, as a lot of people know, I live and am based in Brazil. I would say Brazil is maybe 7 to 10 days, maybe 2 weeks behind the U.S. on the epidemiological curve. So Brazil, which has a slightly smaller population than the U.S., but only slightly, it's the 6th most populous country in the world, is now arriving at the point where we have 700, 800 deaths per day with the official count. And by all accounts, it's much, much, much greater because of the lack of tests. And, you know, you have, you know, glittery TV stars who work for the big networks who go on and kind of inveigh morally about the imperative of staying at home. And the reality is 70 to 80% of the population, at least, that lives in extreme density in favelas can't stay at home, because if they do, they're literally going to starve to death, because it's the government has provided extremely little in the way of government assistance, and it's delayed and it's difficult to get. And so staying at home is really a privilege. It's a privilege if you live in the West, if you live in a country that does offer the kind of sustenance that's necessary if you've lost your job, or even if you haven't, with the economy slowing down to almost zero, to be able to do it. And it's a luxury if you live in any country and you have the kind of job like we have that allows us to work from home. But there's millions and millions of people everywhere who can't work at home, who can't stay at home. And then there's a lot of people who just believe that it's repressive and tyrannical to force them to do so. And I agree that while there's some elements of those protests that are really ugly and driven by very ignoble impulses, there's a lot of people who are just in good faith saying our lives are already so difficult, and now you're going to force us to stay at home and provide very little support that we would need to do that in a way that enables us to have any kind of quality of life. We choose to go out, and that should be our choice. And I think, you know, the thing that you touched on in your question is the most important thing, which is what is the nature of the Democratic Party? A couple of weeks ago, Nancy Pelosi did that interview where she showed off her massive, you know, dual industrial refrigerator, each unit of which cost about $30,000, which is more than a lot of people make in a year, and showed off all of her, you know, like fancy ice cream that had been placed, obviously not by her, in very orderly ways. She's very proud of this, like, designer ice cream. And it resonated and revolted a lot of people, not because people think Nancy Pelosi shouldn't be able to eat ice cream, which is how a lot of neoliberal pundits tried to frame it, was because it illustrates what the leadership of the Democratic Party is. They're not people who have anything to do with the working class. Nancy Pelosi and her husband are worth, you know, $100 million. She's one of the richest people in all of Congress. So is Dianne Feinstein. So is the entire leadership of the Democratic Party. Joe Biden and Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton live in these massive multi-million-dollar estates with weekend houses and summer homes, and they're so out of touch with the ordinary American. So of course, it's so easy for them to stay at home. We're going to give you a few crumbs in the stimulus package and keep your mouth shut. And if you know that you're dissatisfied with that, if you go out on the street and protest, then it means you're some kind of like retrograde Neanderthal or fascist. I think that a lot of this is about the cleavage between the party that's supposed to represent the working poor and the working class on the one hand, and the actual leadership of that party. On the other, we see it manifesting over and over, and I don't think it's ever been as kind of vibrant, this breach, as it has been over the last few months, as this pandemic has made all of our lives difficult, but in very different ways based on our position and status.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that a little bit, because I think you're completely right about the nature of the Democratic Party. And I also think that this is another area where there is, and people forgive me for this terminology, but I do think there is like a silent majority in the working class, in the sense that most polls in the United States, it's like a healthy 70%, and it tracks pretty closely across the board. People do want to shelter in place because they understand the enormous danger of this situation. And many people, certainly speaking from New York, like, people who've died or people who've gotten extremely ill. And so you have this dynamic where, Congress collaborates in a bipartisan fashion. I think, Bernie, I want to always give credit where credit is due, got a couple of decent things in there, but it passes this just monstrosity that's basically just a giant, monopoly consolidation for platform capitalism. Then, that's totally screws workers and poor people across the board, and many middle class people, in fact. And then you do have these protests, and I want to just balance and run this by you as well, that there is always the kind of neoliberal pundit tendency where it's like, oh, okay, that's somebody, I don't like their clothes, I don't like the cut of their jib, they're out here demanding a reopening, that's unscientific, blah, 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 blah. And so a couple of weeks ago, I was resisting that. I was saying, no, look, we got to be honest here. There is a huge economic need. But then at the same time, we also need to be real, obviously, that there is a funding source from the DeVos family for these protests in Michigan. And now in the last couple of weeks, there's been a huge change, I think, between a mixed group of people, some of whom were like Proud Boys and that kind of trash, but also people saying like, hey, I can't afford truck payments. I can't, like, I need this stuff, the real stuff. And then in the last couple of weeks, it has gotten into this sort of like menacing gun, Confederate flag, Nazi thing. And then you want to run in tandem with that too. Like it's so fast moving that we can't get attached to one particular narrative or interpretation, which is always what we're hearing, whether it be, from basically all mainstream partisan pundits. So that's just my riff. Do you agree, Glenn? My monologue.
Well, I think there's a lot there to kind of dissect. So first of all, and Anna alluded to this earlier, which is, one of the things that concerns me a lot about the pandemic and the lockdown measures that, as I said earlier, I support. And by lockdown, I mean some kind of combination of voluntary quarantine with some degree of government enforcement, not necessarily the maximalist lockdown models that we're seeing, is, if you think about it, one of the most important things to have a healthy democracy and a healthy government and political order is that the people who wield power, economic power and political power, have to fear the majority of people who don't wield the greatest power. If you look at like the 20th century, American oligarchs typically kept ships offshore out of fear that one day there would be a socialist revolution. They would have to flee, which is a fear that you want them to fear, to feel. And, for that reason, FDR was willing to persuade people, the oligarchs, look, this new deal is in your interests because it'll preserve the system of capitalism that will let you continue to be incredibly rich, but you can't starve people to death or like make them have mass misery, because if they do, they're going to revolt and they're going to protest and they're going to overturn the system on which you depend. So even though we're giving to them more than you want, it's actually beneficial for you. That's that fear that they need to feel, that if they go too far, the order that they want to preserve will be imperiled. Now that we're all stuck at home, where does that fear come from? We can't even gather together in a protest, both because we're rationally afraid of one another and getting near one another because we're viewing one another as vectors of a lethal disease, as opposed to fellow citizens with whom we engage in solidarity and in comradeship in order to agitate for political change. But we're also often prevented by the state using the power of the police, of violence, from gathering together. Or Amazon will fire you if you try and do it, if you go on strike. And so we've really become, we were already pretty weak in the face of these institutions. We've become infinitely weaker. And so there is a part of me that wants to see some defiance on the part of the citizenry. But at the same time, I think it's important to realize that kind of the neoliberal pundit, by which I mean the kind of sweet spot of the establishment, Democratic and Republican Party, operative, spokesperson, journalist, always hates protests. Because real protests. I don't mean like a nice little march that has a permit and all that. I mean like a protest movement. Like they hated Occupy Wall Street because it was like dirty encampments to them and it seemed kind of threatening and they couldn't really control it. They hated the Tea Party movements, which also started off with anger about the bailout and then quickly got co-opted brothers and the right into being just like this kind of anti-corporate tax standard right-wing movement. But it started off like with some pretty interesting overlap with Occupy Wall Street about anger about the bailout. They just always hate protests. They want to delegitimize protests because protests are what put fear in the hearts of elites. And so I think a big part of the reaction to these protests that we're seeing, the reason why there's an attempt now to just write them all off and demonize them all using, the fascist elements that are part of it, is exactly because there's always this instinct to demonize any kind of protest movements or any attempt to bring about political change outside of the very prescribed and controlled means that the two parties jointly approve of. So I think there's a lot of that going on too, but that's one of the things I really worry about is that we're really more fragmented and divided and just weaker, even like physically weaker, because none of us can exercise or just kind of sitting at home than we ever have been before. And I really worry about what the enduring and ongoing effects of that will be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, when I looked at the initial coverage of the protests, I couldn't help but think about the way the media portrayed Occupy Wall Street protests, right? I mean, it was not a mistake that they would focus on specific people who apparently didn't seem like they knew what they were protesting about, for instance, to kind of paint this picture of the movement, right? And so I think, people who identify as, I'm on the left, for instance, don't fall for like the mainstream media narratives in regard to protesters. I think it is important to kind of disaggregate like the bad faith actors and the members of the Trump administration who are helping to these protests. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's representative of all these protesters. I think we need to be able to differentiate between the two groups. I want to go back to the civil liberties issues because there have been problems with the Trump administration exploiting what's happening with this pandemic for their own political projects. So, for instance, the Department of Justice under Attorney General William Barr contacted federal judges and indicated that they would like these judges to hold suspects indefinitely if the White House would like that. Even if they haven't officially been charged with something, which of course, will continue to deteriorate our already lacking criminal justice system. I'm curious if you've followed that story at all and if you can comment on it.
So I haven't actually heard about that particular story. And if anything, that might underscore the point you're making, right? Which is that when there's this kind of intense, constant fear, and we're all focusing on this deadly disease, power centers do get away with a lot more than they otherwise would be able to get away with. I mean, that's something that in ordinary times would never get past my detectors. It's really in the wheelhouse of what I write, and it's just not something I even heard about. And I think I've just noticed, in other instances where I've tried to raise concerns about what the Trump administration is doing with regard to civil liberties or what particular governors are doing here in Brazil, the same thing, there's very little to even want to hear about that. And I understand why, because when you're hearing constantly about, people dying hideous deaths or even suffering so severely, even if they recover. I mean, Michael alluded to that earlier. We all are now starting to know people personally who have become infected, who have suffered greatly, or who have died. It seems like to most people that it doesn't make a lot of sense to worry all that much about steps that the government is taking in order to fight off this virus, to keep us alive. I know, that video that you started off showing that went viral, I got attacked by a lot of people, like Silicon Valley defenders and authoritarians, is saying that, oh, look, my priorities are so inverted, that I would care about this harmless robot, when in reality, all it's trying to do is this really benign function of warning people to maintain social distancing. Nobody really wants to think about, when they're scared, what the government is doing. And the governments know that. That's why they like for fear levels to be high, because sometimes we just are distracted and we don't even notice what they're doing. But then when we do notice what they're doing, that fear is such a potent component of our psychological makeup that it's very, very easy to exploit. Oh, we're just doing it for your own protection. So I can't comment specifically on that particular initiative, but the fact that I can't is kind of disturbing.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly the point. And it was an initiative a couple of weeks ago that Bill Barr, it was something that would have had to go through Congress because it was a DOJ request. But essentially, it would, in times of quote unquote emergency, as very broadly defined, basically, allow trial without detention. I mean, it would be a direct threat of habeas corpus. They tried, they put out a bureaucratic no, this is just logistical, but the consequence is the consequence of it. There was also something in it, I don't know what happened with it, of potentially being able to charge people with bioterrorism if you knowingly expose somebody to the coronavirus. So there's a lot to it.
Quickly interrupt, it's funny because when, I've talked about this before, prior to 9/11, I wasn't paying a lot of attention to politics. I was focusing on my law practice. I thought that was more kind of consequential and impactful. The politics of the 1990s seemed kind of small scale, with the Lewinsky sex scandal that never really interested me. There weren't, it was after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, and just seemed like there wasn't a lot at stake. And after 9/11, one of the first things that really re-grabbed my attention when I, in terms of politics, was this case of Jose Padilla, who was a U.S. citizen who was in Afghanistan and returned to the United States, and who was arrested at Chicago International Airport, at O'Hare Airport. And the government, the Bush administration, charged him as an enemy combatant and put him in a military brig in North Carolina with no charges, no trial, no lawyers, nothing, and kept him there for 2.5 years. And it shocked me, not just that the U.S. government had done that, but that it received nobody cared, because it was March of 2002. It was 5 months after the 9/11 attack. People were still petrified. The anthrax attack came after that. And that was when I saw, wow, when you put the population in fear, you can do anything, right? That's the line that we always think will never be crossed, that the government will have the power to start rounding people up, which, as I'm listening to you, is what Bill Barr is suggesting, and kind of claim the power to imprison American citizens without any due process rights, no habeas corpus. But the government did do that, and not just in theory, but in practice after 9/11, and it received very little attention. That was one of the first things that propelled me to want to start writing about politics.
Glenn Greenwald, we're really grateful that you did that, and we appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Congratulations on the new show, guys. Thanks for having me.
All right, folks, we'll take a brief break, and if you're watching, hit subscribe. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Weekends. I'm Anna Kasparian, and let's talk about some salt. All right, let's sprinkle some salt into this show. So look, there are very few things to like about the Trump administration. In fact, I would argue that the only tiny silver lining that I see is the way Donald Trump reacts to members of his own party who are not adequately loyal to what he wants, what he needs, and the crimes he wants to commit. One of those people was Jeff Sessions early on in Trump's tenure. And Sessions thought, I got to play by the rules. I'm going to go ahead and recuse myself in this Russia investigation. And that made Trump furious because he wants to be surrounded by lackeys. He wants to be surrounded by people who carry out whatever Trump wants to carry out. And so Trump's been attacking Jeff Sessions over and over again. And maybe this makes me a bad person, but I have personally enjoyed watching these moments in the Trump presidency, because for all of the strongman, tough guy persona that, the right wing politicians have, it's so easy for Trump to just go in there and I don't know, for lack of a better word, unman them. And that's what you're about to see in this.
If you're a bad person for liking that, Anna, then I'm an awful person.
Well, okay, then we're bad people together. Yeah, it is amazing. Like this next clip, if you don't appreciate how awesome this next clip is, then I don't know what to tell you. Here is Jeff Sessions getting interviewed by Fox News.
He goes on to say that you were a disaster. What do you say to that, sir?
Well, I did what I had to do. I was appointed his attorney general. I was honored to take that office.
He goes on to...
Oh, I love that so much. I love it so much.
Sessions is a cock. And I remember at CPAC a couple years ago, Trump did okay, I always tell this story. I have to tell it again. A couple of months prior to this speech, I think this is in 2017, maybe 2018, someone like Bob Woodward had put out some dumb book about, the gossip inside the White House. And apparently Trump called Sessions, in Trump's words, as quoted by Woodward, a retarded Southerner. And Trump got out on Twitter, I'm sure because he had anxiety because he's pretty popular in the South, and said, I never said that, never called him quote unquote, blah, blah, that a retarded Southerner, never said that. Being from the South is great. 2 exclamation points. It was a very good tweet. And a couple months later, he's at CPAC and he's doing impressions. And all of a sudden he just does his actual impression of Jeff Sessions is just, I'll recuse myself.
No, it's amazing.
It's
amazing.
A couple of months after violently, I would never say that. He did the most howdy doody impression I've ever heard in my life.
No, but so it's entertaining to watch it because by all intents and purposes, Jeff Sessions is he's a horrible person who, make no mistake, carried out the vast majority of what Donald Trump wanted. And to be specific, one of the most heinous Trump administration policies was, and it currently is, putting innocent people in cages at the border. I mean, just horrific. And Jeff Sessions was giddy about being able to implement that zero tolerance policy at the border, even as people were fleeing violence in their own countries, looking for refuge here in the United States. These are the asylum seekers, right? So that's part of the reason why I laugh at the abuse that people like Jeff Sessions have to deal with in trying to maintain their own political power, because that's what this is really about, right? These are just loathsome politicians who really don't have any self-respect. They're willing to put self-respect on the back burner in their quest for power. And what Jeff Sessions wants right now is his Senate seat. He wants to win back his Senate seat, which he gave up to work for Donald Trump. And in order to win that Senate seat, unfortunate for him, he needs to appeal to Republican voters, the vast majority of whom love Donald Trump. Donald Trump's approval rating among Republican voters is in the mid-90s. It's crazy. So Jeff Sessions has to go on television and deal with those types of questions, deal with that type of abuse from Donald Trump, and not fight back at all. He has to have that ridiculous smile on his face and talk about how he's, he was a great water boy for Donald Trump. He did everything Donald Trump needed him to do. It's incredible.
And I will say, in my own words, it's a very dim-witted smile.
Totally.
I mean, look,
So
yeah,
good.
he got rid of. I mean, there was slight progress in terms of using the Justice Department to investigate policing and racism and police brutality across the country, reversed by Sessions. Jeff Sessions doesn't get a federal judge appointment, judicial appointment in the 80s. In the Reagan 1980s, this guy had too much of a racism problem to get that appointment. He's Trump's attorney general. I also would say real quick, though, too, that there's this big, if somebody says, hey, I just genuinely don't think Trump is funny, whatever. I guess there's some subjectivity to comedy, sure, although I'm skeptical. But there is a big difference inside. Usually it's a difference between liberals and the left, but of people who just are constantly freaking out about Trump, cannot see when he's actually being hysterical, and people who obviously understand that Trump is just this absolutely grotesque, ridiculous figure. That's actually partially what makes him so funny, is that all of these people have invested so much ideas in him, like bringing back being a real man, even as he is much more analogous to like a 1990s like coffee host and like on some like New York public access show, like making bitchy comments about like, I saw a funny thing happen to me on the way to the forum and those girls are looking fat. Like he has way more of that vibe. Like he honestly, my grandmother is an infinitely better person than Donald Trump, but some of the inflections are like a 1-to-1 between like a Long Island Yenta. So there is something hysterical about that. And my point is like, if you think that Trump is funny and you get how he's funny, way better chance you can beat him. If running around 100%. And just like freaking out about Trump worked, then we would be cruising to a Hillary Clinton re-election. But we're not. So people have to, at the very least, again, dispassionately understand his appeal, which is obviously a really low and disgusting one, but it's also super funny.
Yeah, and one final point on that, because I think you're right. Being outraged by what he's tweeting has not yielded any results that we've wanted. But you have to kind of attack the persona that his supporters find appealing. And it's like this tough guy persona that Donald Trump has. But when you really like take a look at him objectively, Donald Trump is a little bitch. Like he does nothing more than cry all day long about how the media is unfair to me. He's not an alpha male at all, but his voters think he is. So I think that we actually would do better in messaging how pathetic and weak he is, like laughing at him and pointing out his weaknesses incessantly, I would argue, is more effective than constantly being outraged by what he's putting on Twitter, because the truth is he wants you to be outraged by what he's putting out on Twitter. That's worked for him. I think it's been part of his electoral strategy. So don't give in to that. I think it's much more effective to just call him out for the incredibly weak child that he really is.
And the fact that he doesn't look at presidential at all, and it's embarrassing and sad. Guys, I just want to say, as always, Anna, thanks a million. Kale, thank you. Thanks to the whole Jacobin team. If you're watching this and you're new here, make sure you hit subscribe. There's tons more on the Jacobin channel. We will be back next Saturday, as we always are. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you.